Realistic eyes come from a great sculpt. In this video, I'll show you how to sculpt high poly eyes just like this one. This is the first video in a series where we unwrap texture and bring it into Marmoset. Hey, I'm Virtus. I'm a character art director and university lecturer in the games industry. I'm giving all my industry knowledge to you, so don't miss a video and make sure you turn on notifications. Okay, so getting started, this is something we're trying to achieve, a high poly eye. So this can be used on your sculpts for high fidelity, but for this purpose, we're also using it to bake down to a game asset or a real-time asset. Target is something like this inside of Marmoset, so as a real-time viewer, can also be put into Unity or Unreal Engine, but this is all derived from the ZBrush sculpt and also eventually the low poly construction of how the eye is put together. So you can see the eye shader itself is comprised of multiple components. For this video, we're going to be focusing on the inner eye and also the cornea, making that shape inside of ZBrush. Blender or Maya is basically just to preview the assets that we've got. So very quickly, we need to understand the anatomy of the eye, just so we know what components that we're working on. So the one you're probably interested in is the inner eye or the iris. It's all one continuous mesh. This holds all the high poly information, also the texture information. We'll also be creating an outer eye, or also the cornea, the one I'm drawing really badly here. And it's going to hold a lot of shader and reflective information. So we're going to make both of those inside of ZBrush. So I'll take you right from the start in an empty scene. You come up to the tools panel, we'll change this to a sphere 3D. So the orientation is going to be important because we'll be using radial symmetry. We also want it to be facing the front of the character. So if you press space, come to move, we'll take this red indicator and also hold shift. And what we're trying to achieve is a 90-degree turn. So one important thing you want to check is that this is the front of the character. So move this around, it's going to rotate your camera and also your object. Obviously it's a sphere, so it's hard to see where the front is, but that's going to be your guidance. Now, a mistake that a lot of students make is they'll actually move this off of the axes and it's going to mess with the symmetry. So make sure you don't actually move this. Maybe just duplicate a version so you can come back to make sure that you're correctly centered. A handy trick that I do is I take two planes and I rotate them 90 degrees in the subtools, and that just makes sure that everything's aligned and centered. And if it comes off, then I definitely know. So now we'll create the front of the eye and the iris. And this is really important to follow these steps because we'll also be using this as our low poly. So the way we do it, it's really nicely broken into poly groups. So first, rotate to the side. Make sure the mannequin is viewed from the left or the right ear. Hold Control and Shift. It will change your brush settings up here. And while you're continuing to hold that, we want to select Clip Curve. So if you're unfamiliar with Clip Curve, while holding Control and Shift, I can draw down. I can simultaneously press Spacebar, and now I can move this indicator around. So what I'm trying to do is basically cut off the front side of the eye. If you look at the curvature here, we're roughly aiming for about halfway down. So we can adjust this later so it's not too bad. Now, if you let go of the mouse first, and then rotate to the front, you can see that we've got this shape. So how do you know you've got the correct shape? Well, roughly the anatomy of the full eye, if I can draw even a straight line here, you want to be aiming about halfway to the center point of the eye. That's roughly a good sort of metric. Now, this scale is actually really important to achieve because it's going to throw off the actual size of the eyeball and it's going to change how the character looks. So make sure you've got those scales correct. And eventually when we do the pupil, we'll also be roughly aiming for the same sort of direction, maybe 50% through, in between the center of the eye and the outer of the iris, maybe a little bit in. That obviously depends on how much light is going into the eye. So to make things easier, we'll be working a lot with poly groups. So to activate poly groups, you guys can look for an emblem that looks a little bit like this. Press the button and you'll see it's gray because there's no poly groups assigned yet. In the tool section, you'll see that we don't have many options. We don't have any poly groups. That's because it's still a primitive. So coming to the top right of tools, we're going to click Make Polymesh 3D. Okay, now scrolling down to the section of poly groups, there's loads of different options here to adjust how your poly groups are applied. What we'll be using is grouping by the normals. So basically it's going to be looking at the angle of the faces and separating it from there. So if we scroll this all the way down, you'll see with an angle of 13, grouped by normals, it's going to split those two. So for those unfamiliar with polygroups, if you hold Control and Shift and click once, it's going to isolate it. Control and Shift off to the canvas is going to bring everything back. So that's really useful when you're focusing on very specific areas. Now, to create the center of the pupil and the hole in the center, there's multiple ways to do it. Probably the safest is via masking, so we have more control. You can do a mask lasso. Probably a quicker version is if you hold control, we can actually change the mask type to a physical circle, so that's going to help. So aim for the center of the eye, hold control, we'll draw out a circle roughly for the shape that we want. Don't worry about it because we can always change the size of this afterwards. Now once that's selected, we'll then be splitting it. But a common thing that students, and a mistake that is made, is the mask goes through the entire object. So just make sure you deselect the back. So Control and Alt and then draw a circle around the back end so we're not splitting that off. So under Subtools, we're going to come to Split with our mask selected and then select Split Mask Points. You'll see what this has done. It's created another subtool and we're actually going to use this later. So it's important to keep that. So now we're looking to achieve the convex nature of the iris. So a mistake that students usually make is they come into transformation and we can activate symmetry and use radial symmetry in the y-axis. So this is how we're going to be sculpting and painting a majority of the iris. You'll see that I've actually docked this tool information down to the bottom right. So we're going to be splitting up from radial count up and down. If you want to, very quickly, if you want to tear those off, you can come into preferences and config, enable customization, and then with Control and Alt, you can actually drag any button onto the side docks. So that's a separate video in itself, but it will help for this workflow. And you'll see everything's working. This time I'm changing it to Z, and I just hover over some vertices to make sure that everything's nicely aligned. So the mistake people make is they have the radial symmetry with a move tool and then they move it back and forth. The problem is it's starting to warp and it's actually twisting the geometry, which causes issues later. To kind of rectify it, what you can do is hold Alt and then it's going to move back and forth, so it gets rid of the twisting. But you'll see that we've still got some wobbliness because we only have a certain amount of radial count. So it's a really cool trick to get the perfect curvature here. We'll be making use of some really unique masking features. So on the right side under masking, we have mask by feature and there's a couple of options here. We'll be unticking groups and also creases. Now when we press mask by feature, what will happen is you'll see that it selects the border or masks it. So we're going to use this to our advantage. If you hold Control and then click on the canvas, that's going to invert it. Now when we come to the normal move functionality with the gizmo, you'll see that it's moving back and forth and there's no sort of like errors in there in our radial count. Now really interesting, we can actually play with this effect. So with the masking, if you come to the masking options, we can press shrink mask. We're going to switch in between shrinking and growing and blurring the mask, and you'll see the effects that it has. So first I'll hit shrink mask. You'll see that's basically expanding our selection. So already we have that kind of concave nature. And if you want to adjust the shape of that and basically how it's falling off, we can start to blur the mask or sharpen the mask. So if we blur the mask, you see that everything's happening a little bit more broadly. And if we sharpen the mask, everything gets a little bit tighter and more refined. So you can switch in between those two of shrinking, blurring it. I suggest after hitting each button, just test how it looks and get something that you like. For your guys' references, if we're looking from the side, that's basically the shape or the concave nature of the iris that we want. We're going to be sculpting on top of this, so it's all going to change. And I wouldn't worry about how it's shaped for the low poly, because we also come back into Blender or Maya and adjust this anyway. So this is just the starting foundation. So we can make use of this intelligent masking in more ways. So just above the masking option, we have deformation. And under deformation, we can change the size. So if I go up and down, you can see that that's adjusting the global scale, but it's also pushing and pulling it in and out. Maybe you do want that. Under settings and size, we can actually deactivate Z. So now it's going to scale only in X and Y. So what you can do is you actually use that to change the size of the pupil, which is really cool. So this is you guys when you realize that you can subscribe and get loads of interesting information about games and characters. So for the inside of the iris, I want a slight curl. So that's going to add to the effect that when we see it from the side. So I've just come to masking and then mask by border feature. And then using the gizmo, I can rotate this. I can also use the yellow scaler. And just using a combination of that, I can almost make a very slight bevel on the inside. Basically what I'm trying to achieve is a nice little curl in so that we can't see the back side of the eye. So if you see, as I start to parallax this and occlude it, it ever so slightly turns away. Then that's going to work with our subdivisions. So at this stage, we also need to make a cornea. So what I'll do is I'll duplicate the mesh that we've started with. I'm going back to the first one. Around the top, I'm just going to click and drag and scroll back through the history. And we want to take it to a stage where we have the original circle mesh. Okay, so here we have the outer cornea eye. We need to reshape this in a similar manner. So if you come into transparent mode, you can see what's happening under the hood. There's two ways to do this really. You can approach it from the front with a circle mask and go like that. Or probably a better option is to approach it from the side so we can see exactly where the incision is. So change the mask to a rectangle and then we can select just in front of where the iris is going. So now we're going to create the bulge. So over into the masking settings, we will just grow this mask a couple of times. So it gives us a nice smooth fall off. And in combination just above that, we will go to deformation. And for this, I will be using the inflate deformation. So as you see, we can scroll that up and down and it's giving like a bulging view to it. Now remember, this isn't on rails, so you can come back and forth between changing the mask size and then going back to deformation. And in between doing those, you'll basically get the type of shape you want. So if you want to increase the center, you can just grow the mask a couple of times and then click inflate, and slowly back and forth, you'll see that we'll get the desired shape that we want. So you'll see there's quite a harsh cutoff, which is actually what we want. So we know it's in the correct place. To soften that slightly, instead of using the shift, which will be a little bit inaccurate, can come back into the deformation and then we'll scroll up the relax slider a little bit. What it's going to do is just taper off that edge. Okay, then to test this out, just hit divide a couple of times. And then we have the outer shape of the eye, which we'll use later for the shader. So we're almost done with all these parts of the eye. The first thing we really need to do is make sure that they're all interacting correctly. So I'll bring back the cornea and come out of solo mode. And you'll see that there's a little bit of Z fighting going on here. So with the cornea selected, come to deformation, we're going to use the inflate again. Inflate's really useful. You'll be using it a lot in your career. So just bring the inflate up and you just want to increase it until the underneath isn't intersecting, and then that won't cause any problems in the game. So the final setup before we move on to the sculpting, you'll remember we have the pupil. So with the pupil, get the gizmo and just move it backwards. Hold Alt and drag the gizmo right into the center. And I'm going to increase the size of that. And this just makes sure that there's no back face that's going on and no problems. But you'll see from the corner, we can actually see through this. So we want to make a shape that's going to collect all that information. Without over explaining, it basically cuts down on calls and different things like that. So for this, I'm going to activate symmetry. And then in ZRemesher, I will turn the target polygon down really far and then click remesh. Once that's done, I'll also activate the half indicator button down here. Then every time we click that, it's just going to reduce by half and give us some nice geometry, quadded geometry to work from. This one's very simple. Come into the mask and then mask by feature border. Click grow on the mask just to basically taper it. Come back to the gizmo and then we will pull this all the way back. This is almost like a dish or a dome to stop the viewer from seeing through the backside of the eye. Okay, so just double check and view it from all angles, just make sure there's nothing happening here. So you can see there's a slight gap there. So just bring it forth all the way until it almost intersects and then bring it back again. Okay, so now we're on to designing the center iris. You'll see on the left, I've got a number of different references. So it's a mixture of real life photos. I think the problem with eyes is often they're enhanced by photography. So you want to be careful when you're looking for those sorts of references. Anything that exports any height maps are going to be useful, so you can see what the sculpted design is like, but chances that's been made by someone. So I found a reference which is the one that I'll be focusing on primarily. We can see a lot of detail here and we can basically follow along. Another thing I like to do is actually take a photo inside of Photoshop and just extract any shape language. So for example, borders or where cavities are. You can also take it into Photoshop and grayscale it. So that's going to be useful to see where pits and highlights are going to be. So in geometry, let's divide this a couple of times. And remember, transform, we're going to have radial symmetry on in Z. For this one, the radial count, I'm just going to use 8, and we'll be doing the internal fibers of the eye. So start to draw them in. I wouldn't rush this process. One mistake students make is they go in really hard with individual damn standards and just draw the lines out. That basically gives an artificial look. So what I suggest doing is be very light on your Wacom tablet and continue rotating around. Take it from different areas of the circle, so don't focus on one individual aspect. And it doesn't have to be anything too detailed. We're just trying to match it as close as we physically can to the fibers. And as you go in with the dam standard, you'll see that areas start to poke out. And what we'll do is we'll go back over this with something like a clay tubes just to enhance it, or a standard brush. So switch to standard, and then with the standard brush we can just draw any areas that are poking out a lot, and then these can be almost our fibrous areas for the center of the eye. Useful technique is, as we're zoomed in, because we have the poly frames, we can control shift click here and it will isolate the area that we want to work on. Just make sure you don't sculpt too far to the distances. So a little trick for you guys, when I'm trying to put in a bit of random variance, what I do is I actually adjust how I hold my pen. So I hold it really far up the top, and then what happens there is I make loads of sort of wobbly mistakes. So if I hold it too far down, then it's going to be a little bit too rigid. So you can see you can just wobble loads of striations in. And don't forget to look from a distance and zoom out, and maybe just put in 1 or 2 areas which are a little bit deeper. So this would act as our secondary information, because we've got a lot of tertiary here. Obviously when we're zoomed out from a player, we do want to see some enhanced cavities. Observation with the reference is, obviously because this is radiated, the further out it gets, we actually start to see some more holes. So what you'll do is you'll interpret that. So on the border, we're just going to put some bigger areas where it's opening out, it's fanning outwards. And these sorts of observations are basically going to add to your level of realism. Now, obviously we've got perfect radial symmetry here, so it's probably worth just toning this down to maybe 4. And then this is going to give us some more random variance. I'd probably suggest using an odd number, just so the eye can't see it that well. So switch up and down the radial and put some random fibrous information in. But the center is where all our fibers end. So I'll get a really high radial symmetry, and then just go in with the dam standard. And this is going to look quite nice when it comes to the normal map and the bake. When it comes towards the end of the bevel, we'll have some light that's interacting there. So you don't want to make it too small in comparison to real life, because this will be CG or a game. We do want to just about see it from a distance. So usually going about 1 up from realism. After we've done that, we can now just start to smooth the sculpt that we've done and put it back onto the eye. Okay, so next we're going to work on this outer segment of the eye, this bit that's sort of raised and is pulling all the fibers across. But before that, if you are working on a character project, one of the worst things you can do is basically go it alone. So in the link below, you can join our Discord community. So you can post your projects there, get works in progress feedback. And also we have a really cool help section. Whenever if you stumble into a problem, loads of members are there to answer it. It's one of the most active character art Discords. So click the link below and introduce yourself to the community. For this raise section, I'll get a standard mask brush with radial symmetry and just fill in the area that we're basically going to be working on. After you've done that, I suggest holding control and just tapping on the mask, and then that's going to soften it. It means that if we accidentally do any brush marks, they're not going to be so sharp. Basically fewer artifacts in the future. So click and tap that a couple of times. So here we're going to be doing a lot of mask work, which is pretty much a key skill of being a ZBrush artist. But first I'll change the material because the mask isn't that clear. So first we had it nice and shiny so we could see it close represented to the eye. I suggest changing it to something a little bit flatter. This is the 3D Mutiny Dry, so you can actually download this in a video on the channel. Or you can use potentially flat color, basically anything that's going to display the mask really well. The nice thing about the dry version is there's no specular highlights, which are going to throw us off. For this, I suggest coming out of radial symmetry, we're just going to draw what we see in the reference. So we're splitting the center element from the rest of the raised areas. So whether you're working on muscles or characters or facial features, I always suggest brushing in the direction of the form. So you see I'm going from outwards to in, And what this is doing is accidentally giving us some really nice fibrous features when it comes to expanding this area. So try and match your references as close as possible. From my own observations, I see that this is roughly 50% between the outside and the inside. So that's basically what I'm going for. If your mask is a little bit too pixelated, I suggest putting some more divisions in there. So that's basically going to help you. So next, about inserting all the holes that you see that create the fibrous elements. So take your time with this one. Don't rush it. For example, if you tried to rush it with radial symmetry, you would get a lot of weird repetition. So my strategy for these usually is I focus on making the hole incisions first with Control and Alt, and then I'll basically come back over with the mask to clean them up. So you'll see that a lot of the circles actually have sharper tips. I'd basically go back up over afterwards. So mix it up with some small ones, mix it up with some big ones, and then we can move on to the next step. So here what I've done is I've just split the material into flat, so it's only showing my mask. This is also a really good technique as a character artist because sometimes you need to see what sort of mask you're drawing. Now we can just focus on the shape and just sharpening it up. If you hold Control and Alt and then tap on the mask itself, it's going to mask it and sharpen it globally. So that can sometimes be useful. But to be honest, just finish off doing all the holes first and then leave that to the end. So with all the mask brush strokes that I'm doing, I'm basically filling it in this sort of direction to the center because we're going to go back over it with some more sculpted features. Another useful thing to do is you invert the mask by pressing Control and tapping on the canvas. It can give you a different perspective. So if you imagine all the white areas are the stuff that's going to be inflated, it's like the extra layer. So I won't spend too long on that. With that inversion, what we can do now, so you come down to deformations, and then under deformations, we're going to use the inflate slider. So if you inflate this, you can actually push it upwards, and it's not just pulling like you would with a brush, but it's actually expanding it, and it's giving us a nice inversion. So after that's done, it's looking a little bit puffy. So what we can do is either go back and smooth it with the mask still retained there, and you see the more of the fibers are starting to come out. Now it's a case of going back over it. So first, before we go and make the secondary and tertiary form of the fibers themselves, we're going to bulk this up a little bit. So using the clay tubes, you see the standard brush has this very harsh squared look to it. So that can be useful sometimes. So we're going to adjust this so we can do less smoothing. So we'll change two settings. The first one is in the alpha section. So dock that to the side by clicking that button. And under the alpha, we have modify. So within modify, we have a blur function. So if we enhance that blur, what it will basically do is it will make this edge a lot less sharp. So the best way to see that is actually test it out. So we want a little bit of sharpness just so we can get those fibers inside of it. Now this point is up to you. You can either freehand it so we can get this nice wobbly effect to it. But usually what I like to do is use something called lazy mouse. So with lazy mouse, you'll go into the stroke options, open up lazy mouse, and then we can toggle this on. It's also L on the D-pad. So the one you're probably going to be interested in is the lazy radius. It's basically the size of the red wire that you're going to see. And for those that are used to it, what lazy mouse does is basically smooths out your brush strokes, leaving this almost like elastic band, and it makes our steps a little bit smoother. So what we'll do is start from a distance with primary forms and just work from the outside in, basically trying to follow what we've already created with the holes. And the nice thing about this is where it's already masked, it's going to create a nice separation. So go across the entire thing, go as light as or as hard you want with the Wacom tablet, and basically try and dodge the holes that you've already made. And just these little rules that you give yourself, as in like dodging the mask or shaping it in a very certain way, it's just how the underlying mesh is presented with all these tiny little fibers. You'll also see in the reference in areas of the borders, it's actually raised quite a lot. So what you can do is go back over and just enhance those areas and bring out little bits, maybe bring them back to the border of the eye. And here we're really constructing the foundation. So the large forms and the secondary forms, and I definitely want to get this border popping out. Change the angle so you can see what sort of effect you're having. You can also mix this up a bit by using a different brush. So for example, the move brush is going to be really useful for this. We can actually pull and push areas of this. If you don't want it to warp based on the camera, a useful tip is to basically hold the move brush with the Alt, and you'll see now that it's coming in and out based on the normals of the actual object. So this is far more useful for the task that we're doing, which is basically raising the platform of the fibers of the eye. So continue. Nice thing about this is you can look at it really harshly from the side, and it's going to move in the frontal direction, which is very useful. So next, go over, just give a very slight smooth, like a global smooth. Try and get rid of any brush marks that you want. So obviously you do want some of the brush marks to stay there. So there's some nice striations. So after we've done that, we've now got a really solid foundation for the eye. Now, to be honest, in the games industry, if we were doing a fast character, to be honest, this would do pretty well. We could texture it and put it in. But if you want to go the extra mile and just put some extra details in there and use the eye on multiple characters, so you know you can have those like close-up shots and stuff, we can just put some more tertiary detail in. So for this, what we'll do is blend everything back that we've already had. For this, I'm just using a standard brush. I'm going to go over and push and pull areas back in. So it's in this stage, it's just about enhancing and pushing back features that we've already got, adding some variation. I'm just making these a little bit sharper so they look like they're being stretched from the center of the eye to the outer eye as well. You can also sharpen up the inside of the border. So for example, to save time, I'll just do this little area. So I'm going over with a standard brush, pressing pretty hard with my Wacom, and then I'll hold Alt and then go on the inside. And this is going to give us a very confident internal edge. And the confident internal edges are the things that really pop out when it comes to the normal map. So if we zoom out from a distance, you can see the difference from the area that we worked on here in comparison to the soft blobby area down there. So it really does make a difference when you zoom in and just focus on individual areas. You obviously don't have to do it across the entire mesh. We can just pick and choose one or two areas that are going to pop out. So for example, down here, we can just work on this a little bit more. And I suggest to all my students at university is just take your time. The worst thing you can do is rush it, and then the results aren't going to come out well. And then you basically have to go along and redo it, and inadvertently you waste some more time. So now we've got the larger forms and the medium forms, you know, you'd go around and do that across the entire thing. We are now safe to add some more divisions. So we've gone from about 1 million active points to about 8 million active points. So just be aware of that, maybe save it in case it crashes. But this is so we have some more detail access. So I'm going to work on this top area again, and you can assume this will be across the entire mesh. And now it's just a case of putting some more tertiary details and following any sorts of form that we can already see. And the more detail that you put into this mesh and this sculpt that you do now is going to help us in the next phases that I'll show you, which is texturing the eye, because it will all come out really nicely in the bake. So we'll have really strong cavity, we'll have really strong ambient occlusion, and it just makes the entire texturing process far easier. So another mistake often I see in experience, sort of like people when they're first starting out, is potentially that they'll try and match this reference identically. Now, a lot of these fibers you won't actually see in the game. So just try and imagine a couple of detail levels above what we've already done. So next I'm going to show you a tip that I picked up along the way, which really enhances sculpts. And you'll be able to see the part that we've worked on in comparison to the other end. So usually what I like to do is once we've got those major forms, you can see that they're flowing in and out, is come to the dam standard. We use quite a big brush, and what we can do is hold Alt and very faintly go along the borders and areas that we want to enhance. And this will really make it pop out. It's almost tucking the fibers underneath themselves, and that's what gives like a really nice confident normal map. So we're just going over and enhancing those center areas. For example, the holes, what we can do is maybe just stroke down them a couple of times to add some nice variance inside of there. So again, just stroking in the direction of the eye. Even if I'm making a hole, I don't do that sort of circular motion with the brush. I'm just brushing in one direction, and as I'm brushing in one direction, I'm creating that hole. And what you'll get is loads of, as Bob Ross says, happy accidents that feed well into the final look and design. So as a sculptor as well, you do want flat surfaces and areas of rest. So a really good one for that is the Trim Dynamic brush. So now when we go over, we can just flatten some areas and remove a bit of the noise and remove a bit of the chaos, and just let the eye rest and the normal map rest, and that'll be very useful for the future sculpts. Now, if we really wanted to make this much better, we can make some more keen observations. So in the reference, you'll see that these areas actually continue from the mass that they created in the fibers, whereas what we've done is we've made this really hard shelf. So if you wanted to take it even further, this could be really nice for ambient occlusions. Nice brush for this is actually going to be the clay tubes. So the clay tubes is very useful for bridging gaps and filling areas. So it's almost making an individual line itself. The only thing I've done here is I've actually deactivated lazy mouse, just so I can continuously brush over individual areas and create these bridges. So after you've done those bridges, we can go over with a dam standard just to enhance it, and then it almost rounds it off a little bit. And after you've made that, we can use a different brush called pinch. Now with the pinch brush, it's going to get us really close to that fibrous look. So what you usually do is you create something very broadly and large with your brush, and then you shrink it down to size with the pinch. That's the usual kind of workflow that you can go across. Then after we've put the details in, we can now start to insert the Z interference or the distortions, because remember when we masked this and expanded it, it was all one generic unit, one linear thing. So we just want to come back in and add some variance in there and just get it a little bit closer to the reference. It could be, for example, that we want to shorten some of these areas, so we can come with the pinch and just radiate around it, and then that's going to close some sections up. So the more variance, the more realism. Maybe from the front as well, we want to sharpen some of these blobby areas. Obviously we haven't worked on it, but it's good to see how the tool works. So again, just stroking in that direction, you can see how now these blobby areas are starting to sharpen up. So you can use all these brushes and strategies to basically get the finished sculpt of your eye. Another tip for you guys, and really don't be scared of this, usually people are scared to do it, is to get quite a large standard brush and go back over all of our details. So the nice thing about the standard brush is it's only pushing and pulling in theory. It's not actually adjusting our tertiary and secondary forms. So what you can do is get a sizable brush, hold Alt, and then go in and out, and that's just pushing and pulling elements of the eye forwards and backwards. So you can continuously go back over, start enhancing, pushing areas back. This just adds a nice little bit of wobble and medium details to the height map. Okay, so in the next video, we're actually going to take this through the entire workflow, but I'll show you, if you want to stop in ZBrush, I'll show you how to basically texture this and poly paint it quite nicely, just so you can see it when you're sculpting. And to be honest, it is something that you might be able to export into Substance Painter for texturing. But in the next video, we do actually start from scratch. Hey guys, so here I'm going to show you an additional technique. It's not direct sculpting, but it's a way of getting really high fidelity without the kind of geometry budgets, and also putting all the effort into drawing the individual strands. So if you see here, I've actually got a floating geometry, which are all the individual muscle fibers. So the benefit of this is it bakes down really well, and it's more accurate to what you would see in the actual anatomy of an eye. And you can see the kind of difference that it makes, and especially when the light moves, you'll see the depth and the ambient occlusion and the curvature. So you may have something like this. I suggest coming up to clone, and this is a kind of standard workflow for making character projects inside a ZBrush. We clone something and then work off the side just in case we break anything. So we've got the duplicate version of our eye sculpture, and to create the individual strands is super simple. So you can come up to the top under plane 3D. If you don't have that, you can actually right click and then switch your object to a plane. So something we can draw. Obviously you want to make this a polymesh 3D in the top right as well. So after that, come into your brushes and then curve tubes. And we're just going to create a very rough indication of a tube by drawing the curvature out. You'll see that it's super thick. So the way we change that with the curve still on the screen, you'll see that my cursor is actually a light blue. That means I can edit the curve itself. But if I want to change the thickness, I have to move off to the side slightly, and you see it turns red. And now I can scale this brush down. If I hover back over the curve and then just tap once, you'll see that the thickness is changing. But this shouldn't matter too much. We can change it after in terms of deformation, but just goes to something that's in the same proportions. Okay, once we've got that, we have the background plate there's actually mask. It's kind of hard to see because it's similar to my background. And under split, we'll go to split mask points. This separates the individual curve and the back plate. So we don't need the back plate, we can hide that. Now with this individual curve strand, we can just adjust it, very minor tweaks. Maybe we can come in, use a pinch tool, and that's just going to sharpen the ends. So stroke up and down it and you'll see it's tapering off. Very similar to how we would make hair strands in the games industry. In fact, almost identical. So after this, it's a case of using duplications. So with the object selected, come into move mode. A nice quick way of doing this is if you hold Control, it actually duplicates the version, but you see off to the right, it's obtained in the same subtool. So instead of coming to duplicate and having loads of subtools, which is a different workflow that's sometimes useful, this is just a little bit faster. So as this is going to be radiating outwards, I'm making the bottom slightly tapered inwards in comparison to the opening of the top. So after that, I've got all one subtool. I can now make use of the move topological brush. So it's similar to the move, only this time, whatever we touch first is the floating object that's going to move. So add a little bit of variance in here, nothing too chaotic, because we actually do want this to be slightly uniform. The areas you would focus on is the bottom, just to make sure that this is nicely aligned. And what we're aiming to do is basically radiate this round in an array into a circle and then add adjustments on afterwards. So I'm just going to preempt this with the center one. I'm going to pull that up slightly because I know it's going to be fitting onto a circle. Okay, so here's the trick, guys. Got to work from multiple angles. So just put it slightly sideways and then add some slight Z variance. So this will make the normal map really interesting. The ambient occlusion, it'll just add some additional layers. Again, nothing too crazy. You just want to remove any repetition in terms of the geometry, just to make sure that it's looking nice and realistic. Okay, so now we've got that, we're going to move on to the array. My top tip for you guys is if we were going to duplicate this across, it is only 11k active points, but if we do that a lot of times, it's going to put strain on our ZBrush. So it might be an idea, and I highly suggest it. Come into Z plugins. And for you guys who already know this, we're going to use a decimation. So you can use a custom value here. Currently we're working with 10k. So ideally maybe something around the 1 or 2k will even work. And these aren't complex pieces of geometry, so it's going to work out fine. And what decimation does, whether you can see it or not, it actually reduces the polygon count, but maintains our structure. Now, how you understand if you've gone too low is if you start to see polygons. As this is a game asset, it's going to be an iris. We're not really going to be zooming in this far. This is obscenely close. So any sort of normal map that we're working from here is going to survive. Okay, so another top tip before performing an array, from experience, I really highly suggest doing a quick save. So pressing 9 on the numpad. Get in the habit of doing that for literally anything. If you're doing a Dynamesh, if you're duplicating sometimes, or doing some advanced transformations, I highly suggest just really quickly pressing 9. Okay, so for our arrays under the tool section, you'll see that under geometry, we have something called array mesh. There's loads of settings here. So first we want to activate the toggleable, and then this opens up all our settings ready to go. So everyone will be working on different axes. You might have different alignments. So it's about playing around with this. And I highly suggest coming in here and just playing around with the tool and see what it does. So if we come to offset, we can change the X amount. You can see how that's repeating the object. And then obviously if we do it in the y-axis, it's going to be different. So that can be useful for all manner of things. If you're creating like a sword or something, or some advanced hard surface stuff. We can also play with scale and offset, but what we're interested in is rotate. So make sure that that's activated. So under rotation, we can change the Z amount. This might be different for you. So to go all the way around from school, obviously, 360 is the one we're after. Doesn't have to be exactly accurate. You can just manually type it in. And with the repeat slider, we can now change how many fibers are applying themselves. So we could go with something like that. It would just be a lot of work to undo and put some variance in there. So usually what I do is I like to half it, add some variance, and then duplicate it again. But you'll see that the center, obviously we want a hole there. So there's different settings you can play around with, offset, scale. You can also change the pivot point. So under pivot, we can change the X amount, and you'll see how now this is opening up. So it might be an idea to set the pivot point first, maybe have your eye in the background just to get an adjustment correct. But this is something nice that we can work with. I'm just going to put the repeat up a little bit and then check it from a distance, see that everything's working. So once you're happy with that, we'll come down to make mesh. And you'll see after we've made mesh, it has combined everything together. So it might be an idea duplicating first and then making a mesh, just so you have something to fall back on, because we don't really like things that are overwritten and then saved in the history, because sometimes the history gets deleted and stuff like that. So that's another kind of tip there. If your pivot point has changed, we can use any of the gizmo features like the home or the axes. I like just to manually place it because it gives us a little bit more variance. So now we can take our new array mesh and just test it on the duplicate scene that we made. So coming back to this duplicate scene, you can see there's only one subtool here. If you come down to append, you then get the list of your other tools that are present in the project. So we just created this one and we can see the indicator there. Click it and it's going to drag the first subtool of that tool into here. So after that's done, now it's a case of positioning it. So get the gizmo, hold Alt to change the pivot point, and then we can make sure the correct one is selected, bring it off to the side, use the yellow to scale it down, and then just basically position this. Now, if it's not fitting perfectly, that's totally fine, because in fact, I prefer it like that because we can cut out the center with intelligent masking, and we can also wrap this around the inner of the eye. And the worst case scenario is that you actually don't have enough geometry, and then that's when we really turn into problems. So I usually like to do a little bit extra just so there's a nice section of overlap, like you can see here. And this is going to be seated, all the musculature is going to be seated in the eye anyway. So I'll roughly position it there, and then we can fine tune it with the move tool and stuff like that. What I also like to do is, if you come up to color, I'll change this to a really bright object like a red, and then come to fill object. And then make sure your poly paints are active on each one. So now we can really clearly see where the fibers are. Okay, so now it comes to the move topological and the normal move brush. And it's pretty fun. You just come around and just add some variance in there. Try and follow the natural curvature of the sculpt that you've done, and remembering that these are fibers that are going into the eye. Some of them are clustering together, some are opening up. So you would basically check your reference and try and match that language as close as possible. So I've done so many eyes that I actually almost remember where all the fibers sort of flay out when it comes to sculpting like this. But your main aim is basically just to remove any really obvious areas of repetition, but don't put too much variance in there, because then that's going to really stick out like a sore thumb. So after that's done, I'll then come to duplicate. So we've got a second mesh, and here's where things get interesting. So come to your gizmo, and then we can now rotate this another time. Don't be mathematical about it, just spin it around and stop it where it's feeling right to you and it's looking good. So maybe somewhere like here, and then we can come up to the color, maybe change this to something like a blue. And now we can see both of the subtools and start to move and adjust these in place. So this is a really cool technique for all manner of things. I primarily use it for creatures. I use it on characters' hair. Sometimes some eyelashes and eyebrows is a really great feature to use. And here's the trick, guys. So in the subtools, we have the red and the blue. So top tip, you can basically use the D-pad to scroll up and down. So up goes to red, and now I'm moving the red one, and then I press down on the keyboard, and now I'm affecting the blue one. So you can switch in between these really quickly and just focus on your sculpting. And then whenever you want to move an individual strand, you can move to move topological, which is a different brush, and then move them one by one. So you can see how it's a really fluid process. So I'm not going to go around and move each one of those fibers. You guys can definitely go in and do that. Another thing you can do is, if you want to make an adjustment, say from the distance it's looking a little bit too thin, we can actually come down to deformations, and here I'll be changing the inflate brush. So you'll see what the inflate does to the main object. So if we want it thicker or thinner, we can make those adjustments in the deformation tabs. As it is now, it's perfectly good. We don't want it too small because it won't come through on the normal map, and we don't want it too big because it'll look unrealistic. And always look at from a distance and see what you're working from. Okay, after that, remove the color by pressing the individual paintbrushes, and then make sure your color is set to a gray, and then you can see the effect it has. And then from this point, it's all about matching it back to the surface and having it all blend nicely into the sculpts that you've already done. So loads of lessons on that one. Definitely practice using the array mesh. It's a really powerful tool, and also how we went over cloning and working off side projects when it comes to creating characters. So your high poly is just the start. Next, we will texture this eye, but first you need to unwrap it in a very particular way. There are two things that you can do. You can click here if you remember to download the full project files, or if you'd like to know how to unwrap the eye, then you can click here. Definitely check one of those videos out. If you don't, I will tell you to join members. So waiting for you to click the next video. We'll definitely have some texture optimizations, how to unwrap in Blender, how to apply this nice, pretty texture. Or you can just download the entire file, have it for all your character projects.